So, okay, welcome everybody to the Ecofiscal Commission's final webinar. We have Jason Dion, who is our lead researcher and lead author on this report, who is going to walk us through the research from Bridging the Gap, which we released yesterday. So we're really excited for you to be here. Without further ado, I'll pass it on to him. We will take questions at the end after he's walked through it. So please ask your questions via the Q&A, and we'll do that at the end. And so, yeah, thanks, Jason. Take it away.
Thanks, Annette. So let me just share my screen here. Just a moment. There we go. You're able to see that? Annette, do you mind just confirming that folks can see the slide deck?
Sorry,
Great.
yeah, it's up.
Okay.
Sorry, I just needed to unmute myself.
Sure, great.
Okay.
Okay, so thanks for joining us, everyone. So let's get right into it. So the context for this report is that Canada has a gap to its 2030 GHG target, and the question is, which policies are we going to rely on to close that gap? So our report is set up to answer 4 questions, and these are the 4 questions I'll organize my little summary around today. So the first of those questions is, what are the approaches Canada has available for scaling up policy to meet its target? Second, how do the cost of these approaches compare? Third, what kind of design choices would improve their economic performance? And what are the challenges in implementing more efficient policy? And then fourth, in implementing policy, how should policymakers weigh the trade-offs that these different approaches present? So what does it mean for policy? So let's take it straight to the first question. What are the approaches Canada has available for scaling up policy? So in our report, we model 3 distinct approaches Canada could use. So first is that governments close the gap to the target using primarily carbon pricing to reduce emissions, with revenues going toward dividends, rebates for households. The second approach is that governments close the gap using a mix of regulations and subsidies, so instead of increasing carbon prices. Now, important to note there that when we model that scenario, carbon prices continue to rise to $50 per ton by 2022 as planned, but they don't increase beyond that. They freeze there, and instead, to get the rest of the way, we rely on a mix of regulations and subsidies. The third approach that we model is that governments close the gap using subsidies and regulations that are focused only on industry. So the idea there is that households are left untouched by direct costs. Now again, that carbon price up to the planned $50 per ton stays in there, but it doesn't go beyond that. So in closing the gap beyond that, it's a reliance on industry-focused regulations and subsidies, so households don't have to bear direct costs. So these 3 scenarios, these 3 approaches, one kind of key thing that differentiates them is the visibility of costs. So carbon prices are obviously kind of a very visible policy. People can understand the connection between rising prices for gasoline, for home heating, and the carbon price. Other approaches have less visible costs. So regulations require households and industry to take certain actions. Those actions have costs, so they bear those costs, but they may not always be aware of the connection between the policy and rising prices or other types of costs. Subsidies are also another instrument that we will pay the price of, that subsidies are extended to businesses, to households, have to be paid for by taxes or by public debt. So we bear those costs, but again, their costs might not always be visible. That third approach, the costs are the least visible, that while the whole focus is about keeping households untouched by direct costs, at the same time, with regulations focused on industry, those costs that industry bears are being passed on to households. So we're paying higher costs for goods and services. Maybe there's costs in the forms of employment effects on wages, but those costs aren't especially visible. So visibility is kind of a key differentiator when we look across these 3 scenarios. So these are the 3 that we look at in terms of options Canada has for closing the gap. Now, a few things to note there are that existing policies stay in the baseline of all of these. So as I mentioned, we have that carbon price rising to $50 a ton by 2022, but other policies stay in there too, like automobile efficiency standards that Canada has federally, some provincial policies like a Quebec zero emissions vehicle mandate, British Columbia's low carbon fuel standard. So everything in place now remains, and the question is, how do we build on that to get the rest of the way? Another thing to note is that in defining these scenarios, we take our cue from real world policies that have been implemented in Canada to date, but we broaden or scale up these policies in a way that Canada can hit its target. So an example of that is we look at Quebec's zero emissions vehicle mandate, where a certain portion of total vehicle sales has to be electric. And we say, okay, so there's a precedent for that policy. Given that we have this gap to close, let's use that as one that we broaden nationally and then turn the dial on the stringency to really make it hit the target. So you're seeing policies that are familiar in some cases, but to a degree and a coverage and a stringency that they haven't been implemented to date in order to hit that target. So this might be a little hard for some to read depending on the screen you're on. You can take a look at the report for a bit more detail. But what this slide just basically does is sort of show what these three approaches are and provide a few examples of some of the policies that I'm talking about. So I won't go through it all in detail. It's all in the report, and I'm happy to answer your questions at the end. But a couple of things to note is that when it comes to these policies, again, we're talking about things that go well beyond what we've seen to date. So for example, in that regulations and subsidies approach, you're seeing a regulation that requires industry to cut its GHG intensity of production in half by 2030 relative to 2010 levels. For subsidies, you're talking about covering up to half, or in the case of the third scenario, 2/3 the cost of things like buying electric vehicles, carbon capture and sequestration, efficient appliances. So these things are being paid for by the government, but they're also being paid for through taxes. So we're seeing taxes increased in each of these scenarios in order to pay for those, and in some cases significantly. The other thing that's rising in stringency, obviously, is the carbon price. That in order for Canada to hit its targets, our modeling shows that carbon prices would have to increase, so they're going to hit $50 a ton by 2022 as planned. After that, they would have to continue to rise by $20 per ton per year going forward. So to make that a bit more tangible, that equates to 4.4 cents on a liter of gasoline each year. That would mean that by 2030, we'd be paying 40 cents more on a liter of gasoline than we are today. So again, these policies go well beyond anything in place today. Oh, jumped ahead. The critical thing as well, though, for those carbon prices is, higher carbon prices, but also higher dividends. That the revenues that are being raised from the carbon price aren't just being thrown in a hole, as is the case right now with federal policy. We're taking our cue and saying, okay, the revenues that are collected, they will remain in the province that they originate in, and they'll be returned to households. And in our case, we model it in the form of a per capita rebate. So as carbon prices continue to rise, you're also seeing those rebates rise. So by 2030, you've got some pretty significant per capita rebates in some of these provinces. So about $800 per person in BC and Ontario, and up to $4,000 per person in Saskatchewan. So again, going well beyond what's in place today on the rebate side as well. So with that kind of package articulated in terms of what approaches are we talking about, what do they look like? The question is, how do the costs of these approaches compare? Because while we've talked about a significantly higher carbon price, we've talked about much more stringent regulations. The real question is, well, what does this all cost? And so to look at that, we use some modeling by Navius Research's GTEC model. And what we found is that actually any of these approaches can reach the target, but they differ in terms of their cost to the economy. So let's take a closer look at that. So in this slide, what you're seeing is the per capita GDP under each of these approaches. So a couple things to note there are that under 2 of the 3 approaches, per capita incomes continue to rise. So we're going to hit our target, and we're also going to continue to see rising incomes. So we'll be richer than we are today. But under one of those approaches, the one where households are left untouched by direct costs, ironically, this is the one that ends up costing them the most. That because it relies on such expensive and generous subsidies, because it requires such deep reductions from industry, it ends up being a really expensive way of cutting GHG emissions. So you're actually seeing average incomes falling over the model horizon with this one. Now, another thing to note is that incomes rise the highest under carbon pricing. So you're actually seeing per capita income $1,200 higher, so per person, $1,200 in the year 2030, relative to a regulations and subsidies approach. And relative to that approach that leaves households untouched by direct costs, you're seeing per capita income about $3,300 by 2030. So again, any of these can hit the target, but pretty significant differences in terms of their costs. So there's a few conclusions we can draw from this. The first is about cost effectiveness, that relying on carbon pricing produces the strongest economic outcomes. The second is about subsidies, that approaches that rely on subsidies tend to have higher costs. And the third is about coverage, that narrower policy costs more than broader economy-wide policy. So a policy that excludes households from regulations actually ends up having higher costs. So we can then move to our next question and ask, well, is it possible to do better? So in these three approaches I've mapped out so far, we're taking our cue from policy that's been implemented to date. And it's a fair question, can we design policy to do better than this? Can we make it more economically efficient? But also, what are the challenges in implementing more efficient policy? So what we do in the report is say, okay, let's take these three approaches, and now let's change their design. Let's start with a little bit more of a blank slate and see how much better we can get them. So we do a few things to improve that design. So for carbon pricing, instead of recycling revenues towards rebates, we use it to go towards tax reductions. So we have a narrower targeted rebate that goes after low-income households to make sure they're not unfairly left behind. But 85% of the revenues goes towards personal and corporate income tax reductions as a way of improving the economic efficiency of how those revenues are recycled. For regulations, instead of relying on this mix of prescriptive regulations and flexible ones, we kind of put the prescriptive ones aside. So those are ones that would be very specific in terms of how the goal should be met. So for example, requiring ethanol to be blended into gasoline instead of saying, okay, the carbon intensity of gasoline has to fall. So we focus on flexible regulations. That's those that focus on outcomes instead of the means of achieving them. And we make sure that these flexible regulations have limited duplication and overlap. So instead of having sort of a kitchen sink approach of regulations where you have lots layered on top of each other, as we're seeing in some cases across Canada, we have a limited number of tightly focused regulations that don't overlap, but at the same time provide big, broad coverage across the economy. The last thing we do is we coordinate those flexible regulations with each other. So we try to make sure that they work together, that they deliver a pretty consistent GHG reduction incentive in terms of the cost of that reduction. So in many ways, we're sort of mimicking features of the carbon price in regulations as a way of making them more efficient. So flexible regulations. The last thing we do is we avoid reliance on high cost subsidies. So subsidies can be expensive because they involve picking winners, because in some cases you're paying people to do things they already would have done anyway, and because they have to be paid for through taxes, which has a distorting effect on the economy. So we change these three approaches along these lines to see how much more efficient we can get them. So what we find, and this is a slide that kind of maps out the earlier version of the scenarios in the top three, and then the more efficient version on the bottom. What we find is that we can improve the economic efficiency of these approaches with better design. So for carbon pricing, when we recycle revenues towards tax reductions instead of towards rebates, incomes rise by about $1,500 per person in 2030. So some pretty significant gains associated with efficiency. For that second package, shifting to a package of flexible regulations instead of this kind of big array of regulations and subsidies of all types that overlap in some cases, going to that more targeted flexible approach gives a pretty significant increase in income. So $2,300 higher per person relative to that other sort of kitchen sink approach. But for the third one, what we find is that when you no longer offer subsidies to households, you end up exempting them from climate policy altogether. Because if one of the guidelines of that approach is no direct cost for households, well then you don't target them with regulations. But if you don't also offer them subsidies, because the subsidies are so high cost, all of the GHG reductions have to come from industry. And at least in our model, that's simply not possible, that we're demanding or we're requiring of industry a 2/3 cut in GHG intensity by 2030. But even with that extremely deep cut in its GHG emissions, we find that Canada can't hit the target with this kind of approach. So it sort of reinforces that conclusion about coverage earlier, that households have to be part of the solution. So while we've been able to map out that you can make policy more efficient, efficient implementation faces challenges inevitably when it comes to implementation. That, in theory, we can improve efficiency, but there's reasons why we've seen the policies we have in place in Canada to date. Now, that's true of carbon pricing in terms of its efficient implementation, but it's particularly true of flexible regulations. Flexible regulations are tougher to implement when it comes to their efficient version than carbon pricing. There's a few reasons for that. First, there are more total policies to manage with more individual variables to administer. Second, these policies are tough to coordinate and calibrate with each other. That to make them work well as a package, they have to sort of cooperate and be aligned in terms of how stringent they are. And that's really tough to turn the knobs and dials in a way that gets it right. We had a hard time doing it with the model where we had the benefit of having this complete overarching view of the economy. In the real world, for policymakers, it would be even tougher. Part of the reason for that is that certain types of information just aren't going to be available. And in other cases, they may be held by industry and not by regulators. So a tough administration challenge on that front. The third reason is that stakeholder influence and pressure can make flexible regulations challenging. That where pressure from stakeholders on one regulation causes policymakers to reduce its stringency, the stringency of another regulation elsewhere has to rise for Canada to hit its target. Now, when you're changing them like that, you're actually not coordinating them as well, so that's increasing costs. But where you aren't able to increase the stringency of another regulation accordingly, you might have a hard time hitting Canada's target at all. So some challenges when it comes to implementing flexible regulations. Not to say it's impossible, but the point being they're hard to get right and they're easy to get wrong. So with that said, we can now move to this fourth and final question the report asks, which is, in implementing climate policy, how should policymakers weigh the trade-offs that these different approaches present? So in our report, we acknowledge that cost effectiveness, while it matters, is of course not the only thing that policymakers have to consider. They also have to think about what stands the best chance of implementation. Now, lots of things affect that calculation, and the visibility of costs can be one of them. Despite carbon pricing's greater economic efficiency, the high visibility of its costs can provoke political opposition. So we've seen that in Canada. We're going to continue to see it. We're seeing it in other jurisdictions. Carbon pricing can be politically tough. But we also make the case that ignoring cost effectiveness, that going with higher cost alternatives also carries its own risks. That as the stringency of these other policies rises, as we make them tougher, as they bite deeper into GHG emissions, the visibility of their costs starts to rise. So at low levels of stringency, when they're pretty tame in terms of what they're demanding, they can sort of fly under the radar. But as you turn the dial, people will begin to take notice more and more. And there's an issue with that in that these policies that have higher costs but lower visibility, well, they might be easier to bring in the short term, but they also kind of represent a false promise that this will continue to happen in a way that you won't perceive. By ultimately costing households and businesses more, they risk causing a backlash that might undermine their own long-term political viability. And so for an example of that, we don't need to look any further than Ontario's feed-in tariff program, which maybe by all measures should have been something that sort of happened in the background in electricity policy in Ontario without many people taking note. But because it wasn't designed for cost effectiveness, it produced a strong backlash that undermined support for renewable energy policies of a totally different type in other parts of the country, and later to carbon pricing in Ontario. So we should be very careful going with options that aren't cost effective. So we make the case in the report that while carbon pricing may have higher visibility, and that might make it more tough to implement, especially at the beginning, in the end, it might actually be the way to get stringent and effective and durable climate policy in place. Because on the one hand, people will know or understand, and that might be difficult to explain and to communicate, but there will be evidence that this is the most cost-effective approach. If they get wind of the fact that we've gone with another approach that is high cost, that could produce a backlash. So by going with the most cost-effective approach, you can help put those concerns aside. But it also has this opportunity when it comes to the revenues, that when carbon pricing is paired with these rebates, you can do two things. One, when you return them revenue neutral, you can signal to people that, look, this isn't about growing the size of government. This is about creating the incentives we need to meet Canada's climate pledges. But you can also signal that there will be help in terms of the costs, that this will be made affordable. So some modeling from the federal government that's been backed up by independent analysis says with the dividends, actually the majority of households would come out ahead. And the power of that pairing is what might make carbon pricing the more durable and lasting and effective climate policy over the long term. So with all of that, we then make a limited number of recommendations, just 3. So the first is governments should evaluate whether their policies are stringent enough to meet targets and close any gaps. So, there's evidence that we have a gap. We need more policy if we're going to hit that target. The question is which? Our second recommendation answers that question. It's if governments want to meet their climate goals at least cost, they should rely on increasingly stringent carbon pricing to do it. Now, they can consider a range of options when it comes to recycling the revenues. Tax reductions is one, and it would have the greatest impact on economic efficiency, but there's also a good case for dividends for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Now, I should also mention that this recommendation is not a puritanical one. It's not about carbon pricing and nothing else. Some previous work from the Ecofiscal Commission, a report called Supporting Carbon Pricing, shows how there's a role for complementary policies to play, that there are things carbon pricing can't do. So we need a package, but what we're recommending in this is that carbon pricing should be the foundation. It should be the central plank of that package. Our third recommendation is that if policymakers choose not to close the gap to Canada's target using carbon pricing, that they should rely on increasingly stringent, flexible regulations instead. So in many ways, this report is kind of trying to take a serious look at this question of, well, if not carbon pricing, then what else? Because we've heard the opponents of carbon pricing suggest there are maybe easier or better alternatives. And with this report, what we've really tried to do is take a serious look at those alternatives and understand what they look like, what would they require in the first place in terms of policy, how do you get to the target using these other approaches, but also what would they cost? And what we find is that just one of these alternatives, this flexible regulation approach, can offer a really powerful way of meeting Canada's targets in a cost-effective way, but that it's hard to get right and easy to get wrong, that it presents its own challenges. So that concludes the slides I had today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the group may have. So thank you.
Jason, there's a bunch of questions on the Q&A that you might want to click.
Yes, okay.
I think Annette may be about to moderate, but I feel like Annette may not have forgotten that she's on mute.
Annette, did you want to steer through some questions, or shall I just take them as I see them here in order?
You may have to unmute her, Jason.
Oh, am I in charge? Okay, stand by. Don't see that I'm able to do that on my end. Okay, no problem. I will.
Well, look, why don't I moderate for you, Jason?
All right.
So this is Dale Bugen. I'm the Executive Director of Ecofiscal, and I will go through some of what you flagged in the Q&A written and keep them coming. So this one's from Stephen. Why do scenarios 2 and 3 not have rebates if they include $50 per ton carbon tax?
So great question, great point. I should have covered that in my remarks. They do include rebates, but only in line with that $50 per ton carbon tax. So they freeze at that point. Excellent point. I'm glad you flagged it.
This is from David. If Saskatchewan gets $4,000 per person, will that be the same for Nova Scotia?
So let me just pull up my slides here. So you will find this in a figure called Figure A in the report, which I believe is in a box. And we actually have the amount for Nova Scotia, which is more to the tune of $1,000 per person. So that's the number that our modeling produces.
Okay, this is from Tom. Transparency and simplicity are also important for long-term political viability. How does the revised carbon pricing version stack up to the original on that front?
So, one thing that we talk a lot about in the report is the question of visibility. And so I talked about it in the summary as well. And that's not only the visibility of costs, but the visibility of benefits. Now, while tax reductions might be best for economic efficiency, admittedly, it is not maybe the most transparent and visible way to return those revenues. If tax rates change, maybe some people make the connection between that and the carbon price. Or if they do, maybe, some time passes and a few years later, the connection isn't made. So connecting the returning of the revenues to the carbon price is a pretty important part of revenue recycling and transparency. So Well, on the one hand, you can do annual reporting of where the money is going, and a lot of provinces do this, and it's important to get that transparency right. Visibility is also partly about communications and making sure that people understand the connection. So in that way, tax reductions might not be as transparent and visible as something more tangible like a rebate.
Feel free to chime in with you guys. If you guys want follow-ups, then add them to the list. I'm going to try to make sure I'm moving through a range of different questioners before I circle back to the second round here. This is from Doug, Jason. Only Quebec's cap and trade system exempts renewable fuels, gasoline and diesel, from carbon charges. Given that carbon taxes are actually higher for low and zero biofuels because of low density and volumetric taxation, that design can be punitive to lower carbon fuels. Increasing the level of carbon price will only exacerbate that failure and not motivate fuel switching, i.e. to higher blends of biofuels. What do you recommend doing about that?
It's a good technical question. I mean, it's not something that I've looked at closely myself. We have a fellow on the team named Jonathan Arnold who's looked closely at biofuels and low carbon fuel standard design and how they interact with carbon taxes. So I might, if possible, have him get back to you, but I'm wondering if Dale himself might have any thoughts on this one.
Yeah, we have this question a lot in our biofuel report, and it's a good point, it's a fair point. And I think that governments do have the information they need to differentiate prices based on biofuel blend levels and based on life cycle emissions from biofuels. And it really is a direct analog to something like a low carbon fuel standard that BC has, where it's explicitly differentiating. So I think there are some solutions here, but it's a good point and it's a fair point. Let's see, okay, I think I've got a few people here. Will we get the 7.8% reduction per year recommended by the UN? So that's the recent UN report this year calling for dramatic annual reductions.
So what we've done in this report is just taken a look at the government's stated target, which was originally put forward by the Harper government and is now being, continued on by the Liberal government. So we've taken that for granted and said, okay, if this is the stated target, what would it take to get there? Now, governments could have other targets. The science is pretty unambiguous that they need to be much more aggressive than they are. So our modeling, our analysis is focused on how we hit that target. A deeper target would require deeper GHG reductions and more stringent policy. So while our report isn't set up to answer that question, I think at the same time, what we've been able to do is sort of say, okay, well, there's the target, and let's run a bit of a horse race between these options. So while I can't answer definitively based on the modeling, I think what we can say is that if you change the target, the merit order of these options isn't likely to change, right? That we might require more of them. You would have to go deeper with them, but that carbon pricing is still, for the reasons of flexibility, because it's a market-based mechanism, and because it has the opportunities that the revenues presents, is probably the most important part of that climate policy foundation, whether you're talking about the stated 2030 target or something much more aggressive that would be better in line with the science.
It's from David. Which country has adopted the carbon pricing with tax reductions? Anyone done a truly revenue neutral carbon tax?
So actually it's right here in Canada, British Columbia, that was the first example of a truly revenue neutral carbon tax. There's been some disputes here and there over how revenue neutral was it. I think by and large, it's fair to say that was the model that they adopted. The new government in that province has said, okay, any increases now to that, what was a $30 per ton carbon price, it's now 35, are not going to remain revenue neutral, that we're going to use it towards other priorities. But I mean, it's fair to say the majority of those revenues are going towards tax reduction. So I'll actually pass it over here to Dale and just to see, I know you did that work on carbon pricing internationally, whether there's also any other examples we'd want to point to internationally.
Yeah, I don't think there are many actually. I think that BC gets held up as that example, and I mean, as you noted, it didn't even last. That over time, changes in government changed the way revenue was used. So I think it's an opportunity for governments looking to try something different, and certainly the Ontario Conservative government that almost was and didn't ultimately end up under a Patrick Brown leadership would have gone down this road. Okay, let's go to Nova Scotia. This is David Stewart. Nova Scotia right now recycles carbon rebates through Efficiency Nova Scotia. Is anyone else doing this as well?
Yeah, so Ecofiscal has a report called Choose Wisely from a few years ago that runs through all of the options that governments have in recycling revenues. And at the end, I mean, at the end of the day, it's pretty agnostic in terms of what the right approaches are. You know, what we say is if you want to promote economic efficiency and minimize costs, that tax reductions are probably the best way to do it. But there's lots of other things that you could use those revenues towards. You can use it to pay for infrastructure. You can use it for rebates. You can use it to adapt to climate change. And you can use it for, you know, efficiency measures and other measures that would help reduce GHGs. The right answer to, you know, what's the right way to recycle revenues is going to rightly vary by government and by jurisdiction and by the specific context and priorities of that time and place. But to more directly answer your question of are other governments doing this, so when Ontario did have a carbon price under the previous Liberal government, the majority of the revenue was going towards measures that would help households reduce their GHGs. So for example, I was actually the beneficiary of one of these in that I was replacing my basement windows and was able to file for some support on the cost from the government because I went with the most energy efficient option available on the market. Quebec, which still has its cap and trade policy, is also using a lot of the revenues to invest in further GHG reductions, with public support for transit being a big priority there.
Okay, this is a new question from Dan. Somebody hasn't asked one yet. How can we help voters understand, and through the politicians, that delay carries a cost? So lack of action since 2010 has doubled the need for emissions reductions and almost septupled the needed carbon price.
Yeah, and in many ways, it's the million-dollar question. I mean, I think the science community, you know, the reports from the UN have been shouting themselves hoarse on this for a long time. I think people understand the severity of the challenge ahead, but, you know, meaningful action is difficult. I mean, we've seen that with the debate that we've just had over carbon prices in Canada. I think in terms of how we're going to reconcile that and really get that through, the message that further delay is just going to make this problem even harder. I mean, that's part of what this report is trying to do, that this is a challenge we need to look head on. Because the reality is that the more we delay, the more costly the transition becomes for the reasons that you're getting at. That we will end up building infrastructure that is ill-suited to the challenge ahead. We will make investments that are different. That if we, for example, the purchase of whenever I'm going to buy my next car, if it can be guided by, you know, where climate policy is going, where carbon prices are going, I might make a different decision. So these sorts of choices are happening right now, and we risk locking in certain types of emissions by failing to act decisively and early, which again, your question signals you understand well. In terms of how we communicate that to people, I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge. I think the depth of the challenge, the severity and the urgency of it is getting through to people. But in terms of actually connecting that to action, it's going to continue to be a struggle, I suspect.
Here's a couple of tricky ones I'm going to lump together for you, Jason.
Sure.
I'm going to draw on your MA in economics to get ready. Can you speak to the effectiveness of carbon pricing in competitive voluntary markets versus monopolistic mandatory markets? And somewhat peripherally, oh, where's my other monopolistic market question? I've already lost it. Here we go. How does your model deal with natural monopolies like electricity?
Yeah, so I'll do my best on this one, and Dale, you might have some thoughts you wanted to add as well. So, yeah, I mean, carbon pricing is going to work best when markets are competitive. So when you have market power, you are going to have very different responses on the part of those that are responding to a carbon price than you will when you have a competitive market where people can compete with each other on the basis of who can be the most fuel efficient. I think there's some evidence actually that this is the case for fuel distributors, that in some parts of the country, the market is oligopolistic enough that there's this limited number of players that have, you know, a disproportionate amount of market power, that what should be strong incentives from the carbon price to start blending fuels simply don't kick in because they have this embedded entrenched position in the market where they control the fuel distribution networks, and perhaps blending other types of fuels, more renewable fuels into the mix isn't in their direct economic interest. So it's slow to happen. So I think actually one of the justifications for the government's clean fuel standards that it's planning is to get around these kinds of market barriers. Actually, in our report supporting carbon pricing, which makes the case for different types of complementary policies, this existence of market power, and when you're operating in an oligopoly, can be a reason for regulations that can do what the carbon pricing can't. Or I shouldn't say can't, but that get in the way of the efficient operation of a carbon price. So yeah, I think when you are looking at a non-competitive market, it might call for something beyond a carbon price. In terms of the question, when it comes to a natural monopoly, something like a public utility, I think that it might not be as responsive to those price signals as it would in a competitive electricity market. So, and that's another area in our report supporting carbon pricing that we point out. So in a natural monopoly, you're either going to have something that is operated as a utility, or it's a highly regulated private utility. And either of those might not be as responsive to market forces and may have to be managed or regulated. Again, that complementary climate policies may have to be brought in to make sure that those carbon price signals are transmitting, or where they simply won't, that actions that are cost effective and appropriate in terms of GHG reductions are happening. So that's my best crack at that question. I'll pass it to Dale, see if he has anything to add before we keep going.
Just two quick addendums to your answer, Jason, which was good. I think important to note that the modeling is a classic economic frame model where it assumes that businesses and individuals are rational and that they are minimizing their costs, at least in the short term. So it's going to not always be right in that assumption, but it's not going to be too far off either. The only other thing I would add is that there's another kind of competitive market that matters here, and that is a global market, and the fact that Canada isn't an island. Canada is a small open economy interacting with everybody else, and not everybody else has a carbon price. And that unlevel playing field creates some complications for carbon pricing, but it also is a problem that has a pretty good solution in terms of the output-based pricing that has really been driven pretty far forward here through Canadian provinces and the federal government. It's part of the backstop, the federal backstop. It's part of most of the provincial policies. And the idea here is that system prices carbon, but also provides incentives for firms that are competing in those global markets, but also high carbon costs, to keep making their stuff. In other words, it's incentive to get cleaner rather than incentive to get smaller. And that's another part of the solution space to these kind of complicated, incomplete markets. And the model does do that one. The model captures that one pretty well. Okay, that was our little wonk departure, but there we go. Okay, so let's try this one. Just to clarify that the report operates on the assumption that a correct amount of carbon pricing will result in behavior change sufficient to meet the 2030 targets. A former Ontario Environment Minister questioned whether carbon pricing would have the required effect in the required time.
Yeah, so I saw those comments as well from Glenn Murray, and that a carbon price isn't up to the challenge because the severity of the problem is so large and immediate. So, I certainly agree. The severity of the problem is massive, and it requires meaningful, stringent action. But I would disagree that a carbon price shouldn't be part of that solution. That, I think what we've been able to show in this report is if you want to cut emissions deeply, you have a number of ways to do it. And a carbon price, maybe it's not going to win a lot of popularity contests, but its efficiency in terms of the GHG reductions it can deliver, but also it's the greater ease of administration, right? That the alternatives, what we've been able to show is, one, they cost more, two, they're really difficult. That you are having to, so here's an example that in the transportation sector, a carbon price is going to encourage people on the one hand to drive less or to drive more efficiently. It's going to encourage them to buy a more fuel efficient car or an electric vehicle. It's going to encourage blending of renewable fuels, well, obviously with that caveat about market power from earlier. It's also going to encourage people to do things like take the bus and walk more. If you don't have a carbon price, then you are going to need regulations and policies and measures that do all of those things. So getting coverage across all of those different modes of GHG reduction, designing a regulation for each and every one of those, or trying to cover them by a whole hodgepodge of different regulations and subsidies, the administrative complexity blows up on you, and the costs do too. So you can think of cruder, maybe more aggressive ways of intervening. For example, like, okay, well, we're just going to dictate, no more of this, no more of that, and let the chips fall where they may. But the economic dislocation and the costs associated with that would be absolutely massive. So, I mean, I am all for aggressive and stringent and meaningful action on GHG reductions. And I'm certainly not saying that a carbon price is the only way to get there, or that it has to be all carbon price. But I really, especially after undertaking this latest analysis where we actually tried to do it the other ways, I struggle to think how we are actually going to accomplish this without a carbon price. Using markets, leveraging the power of markets to help us get there is a really powerful instrument. So I think it ought to be part of the mix, no matter how aggressive we want to go. And I think we ought to go more aggressively.
I'll pick up on one of the threads you raised there about vehicle choices. So this is from David Stewart. To handle a pickup/SUV challenge, have other countries used annual registration as well?
So I'm not sure I understand the nature of the question, but I'll answer it in the way I think I am interpreting it, and you can tell me if I've sort of missed the point. I have actually taken a look at the fact that some other countries use registration fees as a way of providing another market signal that, for example, electric vehicles can be registered for free. And that's another way of lowering the cost barriers of electric vehicles. It's kind of works in the same way that a carbon tax works. So through market signals, you're making the non-emitting choice more affordable, making it the cheaper choice in part. So I think, it's one of the tools in the toolkit. I think in many ways with this report, we've taken a look at the big instruments that are on the table. What are the tools that are up to the job? Regulations, subsidies, carbon pricing. They're not the only tools. So things like registration fees for vehicles, things like public procurement, is the government going to signal, hey, we're going to be a big buyer of things like, the electric vehicles, like efficient light bulbs. That can help too. A lot of other things have a supporting role to play. Information campaigns, right? Like the energy efficiency rating guide, the things that you see on your fridges and stoves. That's really powerful in terms of helping consumers understand the implications of the choices they make. All these things have a role to play. But in many ways, we're talking about the big stuff here that can actually meaningfully reduce GHG emissions. So registration fees as another tool in the toolkit, absolutely, is the short answer.
It's from Peter Shepard. In the public's mind, a carbon price may be seen as equivalent to buying fire or home insurance. Should there be equal emphasis on regulation in our messaging so that people don't wrongly believe that a price on carbon equals the cost of restoration? We need to explain to the public that carbon damage is technically unpriceable and fundamentally different to home insurance.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're getting at the communications challenge here, and it's a tough one. I mean, I'm not sure that I would agree people see it as equivalent to buying fire or home insurance. I think if anything, people see it as a penalty and those that are most opposed to carbon pricing, an unfair penalty on things that they have to do regardless. I think it's not that, and it's not fire or home insurance either. What it is a way of signaling to people that when you emit GHGs, it has a real cost. And so, I mean, this is what the Ecofiscal Commission has been organized around from the beginning, that, the nerd kind of jargon in economics for this is externalities, that when two people have a transaction, but it actually affects someone else at the same time, there's a cost that's not included in that transaction, you get an outcome that is not desirable. Something is being ignored there. And pollution is the classic example of an externality, and carbon pollution is the big one out there. So the problem is that when I go to buy, say I bought, a Ford F-150 instead of a Volkswagen Golf, the greater fuel consumption associated with that choice imposes a cost on all of us in terms of GHG emissions. So the way that I would be most keen to see it click in people's minds is that there's a real cost that nobody's paying right now. And that's the problem, that we ought to pay what things cost. That then we can actually get a fair market outcome. The strength of carbon pricing, and this is also part of the communications challenge, is that cost, that price that we're putting on GHG emissions, the government collects it and the government can use it. So it doesn't have to be simply, well, now I'm going to bear this cost in full. It's the cost is signaled to me through the carbon tax, and then the revenues from the carbon tax can be returned to me in a way that makes it all affordable. And this is something, if I could say that there's one thing that isn't clicking in the public's mind, and it's a tough communications challenge, it's this, well, if you're just giving the money back, what is the point? How does that, does that even work? And the answer is that it does work, because everybody gets the same rebate, no matter how much GHGs you emit. So if I can find a way of cutting my GHG emissions, I'll save money on the carbon tax, but I'll get the same rebate. So the more GHG emissions I can save on, the less carbon tax I'll pay, and I can actually stand to come out ahead. So for me, it's a matter of signaling that this stuff has a cost, but then using that revenue to help bear the cost. So I think it's a powerful combination, but the communications challenge is a massive one, obviously.
Here's a question about the scenarios from Tom. He's asking, did you model a percentage increase instead of the $20 per year escalation after 2022? He's asking other trajectories for stringency. Yeah,
so the way it works in our model is it's 5-year time step. So 2020, 2025, 2030. So we have a carbon price that rises to the certain level that it hits by 2030. From the model's perspective, it's sort of indifferent to what happens year over year. It's more about the average. So I think we could map out different pathways to get there, and something that climbs steeper in the near term and then slopes off is going to cut more emissions overall, but it's also going to be more of a kind of a quicker transition that might have a little bit more costs in terms of economic dislocation, but lower GHG emissions. So there's lots of price paths out there. I think that we've communicated it in terms of, okay, well, we know we're headed to $50 a ton by 2022. What's the pace of increases that it would take to get where we need to go after that? It's $20 per ton per year. So we could go faster in between now and 2022. Doesn't seem like that's on. I think that the government has been clear that the $10 per ton is the plan until 2022. The pace after that, I think, is an open question. So we've shown one path that could get us where we need to go. You could also do it as a percentage increase instead. I guess I would be inclined to say the most better to be clear and predictable and understandable. I think a percentage growth rate might be a little harder for people to wrap their heads around than a number like 4.4 cents on a liter of gasoline per year. And I think the better we can communicate it and the more clearly we can communicate it, the more people can understand what's coming and have a chance to plan and adapt and invest accordingly.
Okay, David Stewart's linking to a Forbes article, and we'll go into it, but the idea is this Goldilocks price, that the idea is that too high a carbon tax will act as a disincentive to the overall economy, and too low will not have enough an effect on the emissions. You have to get the level just right. What's your reaction there, Jason?
So, I mean, it depends what your goals are, right? I mean, if just right is something that doesn't, impact the economy too much, then you have to ask, is that going to add up to the amount of GHG reductions that we actually need? So my point of view is just right ought to be defined by what it takes to hit our pledges, and ultimately what the science is saying that is required in terms of action. And then once we understand where we have to go, to look at the toolkit in front of us. And that's what this report is all about. Which tools are we going to pick up and use? Our modeling suggests that you have to have some pretty steep increases in the carbon price to get where we need to go. And luckily, what we've been able to show in this modeling, not luckily what we've been able to show, but the result is quite fortunate in that, hey, we can actually hit the target and the economy can continue to grow. So from my perspective, at least, I mean, I know people are going to hear the carbon tax number we're talking about, the type of increases we're talking about, and say it's too much, it's too fast. But 4.4 cents on a liter of gasoline, I think, is manageable. And we're not talking about flipping a switch and increasing gas prices by 40 cents a liter overnight. We're talking about a steady climb. And so I think when you are looking at the prices, it can maybe provoke one reaction, but let's talk about the costs. The costs of that are that, well, actually, we're still going to be richer in 2030 than we are today. And relative to all the alternatives, which I think are often not articulated in their full detail. We have carbon pricing, but we have these other approaches. Well, here's what they actually look like, and here's what they actually cost. I think we ought to go with carbon pricing, and that a steep climb in the carbon price is actually manageable in terms of economics, and we know it's what's necessary for dealing with climate change. So let's get on with it.
From Stephen, how do you suggest we deal with emissions from agriculture, given that currently they are exempt from the carbon tax?
Great question. So it's not something that we got into in detail a lot in our report. I think we did include one regulation on manure management in the agricultural sector. It's a tough one. So the power of a carbon price is that it can attach a price to GHG emissions, but only those GHG emissions that we can measure relatively easily. So, we know how many GHGs are associated with a liter of gasoline, with a certain amount of coal, with natural gas. So we can attach that price to those fuels pretty easily. Agriculture and land use emissions are different. So the methane emissions that come from land are diffuse. So we're not really able to measure them in the same way we are GHG emissions from other sources, from large industry or from fuels. So they don't lend themselves to a carbon price, and that's a challenge. We also, so to return to this other report of supporting carbon pricing, we went through in that report, well, there's a few rationales for what might make sense in addition to a carbon price. And one of those is what we called that it's a gap filler, that it fills gaps in what carbon pricing is able to cover. And agriculture is a perfect example of that. Carbon prices, maybe for the fuels that are used on farms, that you can do that, but the land use emissions themselves don't lend themselves to carbon pricing. So that's a candidate for regulations and subsidies that would complement the carbon price. And so in terms of the specifics of how you would do that, it's not something we've looked into a lot, but it is a big and important part of Canada's GHG emissions inventory, and one that we ought to be going after regulations. So that's a key nuance that didn't come out in the report. It's sort of come out in some past work, but not something we've taken on in detail, but a key one that I'm glad we got a question on.
Okay, I think we're gonna do one more and then we're gonna leave it at that, everybody. So this one is partly a comment, but I think opens a door to a question. And the point is that those efficiency subsidies funded in Nova Scotia, if you translate them down to $1 per ton, they're rebates of around 10 cents per kilowatt hour, or around $167 per ton, according to David Stewart's math. So given that that's apparently a high stringency policy, does that get us there? Should that be equivalent? Jason, what do you think?
So what you're getting at there is a really important part of this, that the regulations and the subsidies that I was just talking about, these complements, these other things we can do, it's possible, it's difficult in some cases, but possible to calculate what we call their implicit carbon price, that in their own way, they place a price on GHG emissions. The things that they require have costs, so we can look at, well, how much GHG reductions did it drive, and what did that cost, and what does that up to? What does that add up to in terms of dollar per ton terms? So in that other report where we looked at complementary policies, we tried to compare some of these policies in terms of their implicit price. $167 per ton is obviously well above the current carbon price, but it's also consistent with where we think carbon prices need to go. So it's an open question, I think, of is that a useful complement, given that we know we have to go that high eventually. Carbon prices aren't there now, but given that it's where we need to go, maybe it does make sense. Maybe it is cost effective. On the other question of whether it's equivalent. So, I think this is a related and important question where, and just for a bit of background for others on the call, is that what the federal government has said with its carbon pricing backstop is, we're going to have a national price on carbon. So provinces that already have their own systems or that want to design their own systems, we're going to sort of set a minimum bar for what that system has to look like. And we're going to figure out if yours is equivalent. And if it is, then the federal carbon tax doesn't kick in your jurisdiction. So, but there's been a question of, well, what about the regulations and subsidies that have been enacted? Can those be deemed equivalent as well? And right now, the way that the federal government has left it is that those policies cannot be equivalent to a carbon price. And I think that there's a strength in that opening the door to say, hey, instead of going with carbon pricing in that province, we're going to say, okay, you have enough regulations and subsidies that it's equivalent. The challenge with that is that we know, and we know from this analysis that we've just walked through, that these approaches are more costly. So I think it's a strength of the federal approach that they're going to ensure a carbon price nationally. There's also a strength in that when it comes to Canada's competitiveness and the predictability of its investment environment, that companies looking to do business across Canada can understand that there's a price on carbon nationwide. You're not going to have provinces competing with each other as much on the basis of their climate regulations and subsidies and carbon pricing, when carbon pricing is the foundation of the approach. So it's a tricky one, this question of equivalency. So in terms of whether it is equivalent, you know, I think that's a bigger question of, well, how much GHG reductions is it driving, at what cost? But functionally, is it equivalent to a carbon price? I think it's not. And I think the fact that we are going to have a national carbon price is something worth having nationally.
Great. Thanks, Jason, for walking us through. And thanks, everybody, for the great questions. Lots of good insights there and great technical questions that have tested us. So we appreciate it. And I think I'll wrap that up with that. And this is Ecofiscal's last report and our last webinar. So for those of you that have followed us over the years and paid attention to our various reports and webinars and videos and blogs, let me just say we really appreciate it. And it's been a really fun ride for us as well. And the website will continue to be there and continue to be available. So hopefully it continues to be a resource for you all. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.